I remember sitting in my car outside our empty house, staring at my phone and wondering how everything fell apart so quickly. I'm Sarah, 32, and I just signed my divorce papers last week, ending my 5-year marriage to the man I thought I'd grow old with. This isn't one of those slow burn breakups where you see the cracks forming day by day. No, this was like watching a wrecking ball slam into my life and the person swinging it, my husband Mark's best friend, Jake. Do comment from where you are enjoying the story. It feels good to see where this story is being read and how it's touching lives across different parts of the world. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our experiences makes the healing journey a little easier. You know how some people say hindsight is 20/20ths? Well, sitting here now, I can see all the red flags I ignored, all the little moments where I should have spoken up. But when you're in love, when you think you've found your forever person, you tend to overlook things that don't fit into that perfect picture you've painted in your head. Mark and Jake had been friends since high school. You know, one of those friendships where they finish each other's sentences and have a million inside jokes that no one else gets. At first, I thought it was sweet. Mark needed that kind of friendship, I told myself. Everyone needs a best friend, right? But Jake wasn't just a best friend. He was like this shadow that followed our marriage everywhere, casting darkness over moments that should have been just ours. I can still hear Danny, my sister, warning me about it during our wedding planning. "Don't you think it's weird how Jake has to be involved in every decision?" she'd asked while we were picking out centerpieces. Jake had insisted on coming to the appointment, claiming he had better taste than both of us combined. I laughed it off then, said it was harmless, that he was just excited for his best friend. God, I wish I'd listened to her. The first real warning sign hit me about a year into our marriage. I was planning a surprise weekend getaway for our anniversary. Nothing fancy, just a cozy cabin in the mountains where we could disconnect from everything and everyone. I'd spent weeks getting the details perfect, making sure Mark would have those 3 days completely free. But somehow, Jake found out about it. I still don't know how, but looking back, he probably went through Mark's phone when they were hanging out. The night before we were supposed to leave, Jake called Mark in a panic. His girlfriend had supposedly broken up with him, and he was in a really dark place. Mark looked at me with those apologetic puppy dog eyes I'd come to know too well. "He needs me, Sarah. You understand, right?" And just like that, our romantic getaway turned into a weekend of Jake sprawled on our couch, drinking our wine and monopolizing my husband's attention while I sat in our bedroom alone, trying not to scream into my pillow. The thing is, I later found out there was no breakup. Jake and his girlfriend were fine. They were actually on a break that they'd planned weeks ago. He just couldn't stand the idea of Mark focusing on me for an entire weekend. But when I tried to bring this up to Mark, he got defensive. "Come on, Sarah, Jake wouldn't do that. He was really hurting. Why are you being so insensitive?" That became a pattern in our marriage. Jake creating emergencies whenever Mark and I had plans, Jake showing up unannounced during our date nights, Jake somehow inserting himself into every significant moment of our lives. He even tagged along on family vacations, claiming he needed a bros trip with Mark. My husband couldn't see how weird it was, how Jake was slowly wedging himself between us. The real breaking point, though, that came when Jake lost his job. Mark didn't even discuss it with me. He just announced one day that Jake would be staying with us for a few weeks until he got back on his feet. Those weeks turned into months, and suddenly our home didn't feel like mine anymore. Jake took over our guest room, left his dishes everywhere, and worst of all, he started questioning every decision I made in my own house. "Are you sure you should be spending that much on groceries?" he'd ask, peering over my shoulder at the receipt. "Mark works really hard for that money, you know." Or he'd make little comments about my cooking, my cleaning, even the way I folded Mark's laundry. It was like living with someone who was constantly looking for ways to prove I wasn't good enough for my own husband. I tried to talk to Mark about it. I really did. One night, after Jake had made another snide comment about my expensive shopping habits at dinner, I waited until we were alone in our bedroom. "Don't you think Jake's been a little much lately?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual even though my heart was racing. Mark just laughed, that dismissive chuckle that made me feel like I was being ridiculous. "He's just looking out for us, babe. You know how he is?" But I did know how he was. That was the problem. Jake wasn't just looking out for us. He was systematically picking apart every aspect of our marriage. It got to the point where I started doubting myself. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was spending too much money. Maybe I wasn't being a good enough wife. That's what gaslighting does to you. It makes you question your own reality until you don't know which way is up anymore. Then came the night that changed everything. Mark and I had actually managed to have a nice dinner alone. Jake was supposedly on a date, and we were curled up on the couch watching a movie. It felt normal, like how we used to be before Jake moved in. I remember thinking maybe things were getting better. God, I was so naive. Around midnight, Jake burst through the front door, his face twisted with concern. "Mark, we need to talk," he said, completely ignoring my presence. "It's about Sarah." My stomach dropped as Mark sat up straighter, immediately alert. Jake threw me this fake, pitying look that made my skin crawl. "I didn't want to say anything, man, but I can't keep quiet anymore. I saw her last week at that coffee shop near her office. She wasn't alone." I felt like I'd been dunked in ice water. I knew exactly what he was doing, but I couldn't believe he'd go this far. Jake spun this elaborate story about seeing me with some guy from my office, describing how we were obviously intimate and how he'd been wrestling with whether to tell Mark or not. Every word was a lie. Every single word. The day he claimed to have seen me, I'd been homesick with the flu. Mark had even brought me soup during his lunch break. But Jake was good. Really good. He had details, specific things that made his story sound believable. He described what I'd been wearing, an outfit I owned but hadn't worn that week, the exact time when I usually took my lunch break, even the way I supposedly touched this man's arm and laughed at his jokes. It was like he'd been planning this, studying my habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I watched my husband's face change as Jake talked, watched the trust drain from his eyes like someone had pulled a plug. "That's ridiculous," I said, my voice shaking. "Mark, I was homesick that day. You know that. You brought me soup, remember?" But Jake was ready for that, too. He shook his head, that fake sympathy still plastered on his face. "That was Thursday. I saw her on Wednesday." The worst part wasn't Jake's lie. It was how quickly Mark started to believe it. He pulled away from me on the couch, his body language shifting like I'd suddenly become a stranger. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp. I felt tears burning in my eyes, not just from the accusation, but from the realization that he was actually considering Jake's words over mine, over his wife's. "Of course it's not true." I stood up, anger and desperation making my voice crack. "How can you even ask me that? How can you believe him over me?" But Mark just sat there, his face hardening. Jake stood in the background, watching it all unfold like some sick spectator sport. I could have sworn I saw him smirk. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It costs you nothing. But for me, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue with what happens next. The next few days were like living in a nightmare. Mark barely spoke to me, spending most of his time locked in conversations with Jake. I'd walk into a room and they'd go quiet, or Mark would suddenly need to go for a drive to clear his head. Jake, meanwhile, was always there, hovering, watching, probably feeding Mark more lies when I wasn't around. I tried everything to prove my innocence. I showed Mark my phone records, my work calendar, even got my doctor's office to confirm my flu appointment. But for every piece of evidence I presented, Jake had some explanation, some way to twist it around. She could have a second phone, he'd suggest, or anyone can fake a calendar entry. And Mark just nodded along, like everything Jake said made perfect sense. One night, about a week after Jake's accusation, I came home to find Mark packing a bag. "I need some space," he said, not even looking at me. Jake offered to let me stay at his place for a while. The irony of that, my husband leaving our home to stay with the person who was destroying our marriage, it was almost too much to bear. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. 8 years together and you're choosing to believe him over me? Mark finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes scared me more than anything else. It wasn't anger or hurt. It was nothing. Complete emotional disconnection, like I was already a memory to him. I spent that first night alone in our house just staring at our wedding photos, trying to figure out how we'd gone from that happy couple to this. There was one picture in particular, Mark and I dancing at our reception, both of us laughing because Jake had just made some stupid joke during his best man speech. Even then, he was inserting himself into our moments, but we just laughed it off. God, we were so blind. The separation papers came 3 weeks later. Not from Mark, from his lawyer. Jake had recommended someone, of course. I sat at our kitchen counter where we used to have breakfast together every morning and read through the cold legal language that was dismantling my marriage. The reasons cited were irreconcilable differences and infidelity. That last word made me physically sick. Our mutual friends started taking sides. Most of them believed Jake's story. He'd apparently been quite busy spreading his version of events around. According to him, he'd caught me multiple times, but had been trying to protect Mark by keeping quiet. Each new lie was more elaborate than the last, and people ate it up. Even my own sister started looking at me differently, asking careful questions like, "Are you sure there isn't anything you want to tell me?" I lost weight, couldn't sleep, could barely function at work. Meanwhile, Jake was playing the role of supportive best friend perfectly, posting photos of him and Mark at bars, at games, always with captions like, "Helping my boy through tough times," or "Real friends stick together." Each post was like a knife to my heart, seeing my husband smiling with the person who'd destroyed our life together. But here's the thing about lies. They eventually catch up to you. And Jake's house of cards started tumbling down in the most unexpected way. Remember that coffee shop where he claimed he'd seen me? Well, it closed down. Not just recently. It had been closed for renovations for 3 months before the day Jake claimed to have seen me there. A detail he couldn't have known because he'd moved to our city just 2 months before. When I discovered the coffee shop detail, something clicked in my brain. I started digging. Really digging. I created a timeline of every accusation Jake had made, every story he'd told, every incident he claimed to have witnessed. And you know what? The inconsistencies started piling up like dominoes ready to fall. The final piece came from someone I never expected, Jake's ex-girlfriend, Lauren. She reached out to me through Instagram asking if we could meet. I almost ignored her message, thinking it was just another person wanting to judge me, but something in her tone seemed different. We met at a park far from our usual neighborhoods. Lauren looked nervous, constantly checking her phone like she was afraid someone might see us together. "Jake's done this before," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In college, with his roommate's girlfriend? He made up stories, planted doubts, destroyed their relationship. It's like he can't stand seeing his friends happy with someone else." My hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone and showed me old text messages between her and Jake. Messages where he bragged about his talent for breaking up couples he didn't approve of. Messages where he specifically talked about wanting to free Mark from me because I was changing him. There it was. Proof. Real, undeniable proof. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked her, trying to keep my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. Lauren's eyes filled with tears. "Because I saw what he posted yesterday. About Mark starting to date again. About how he'd helped his friend dodge a bullet. I couldn't let him get away with it again." I sat there for what felt like hours, reading through the messages, each word confirming what I'd known in my gut all along. Jake hadn't just lied. He'd methodically, purposefully destroyed my marriage. And he was proud of it. The next part was the hardest, figuring out how to tell Mark. I couldn't just send him the screenshots. Jake had already poisoned him against anything coming directly from me. I needed someone he would trust, someone whose word he couldn't dismiss. That's when I remembered David, Mark's cousin, who'd always been kind to me even after the separation. I sent everything to David, the coffee shop evidence, Lauren's messages, my timeline of Jake's lies. I sat staring at my phone for 2 days straight, jumping every time it buzzed, until finally David called me. "He knows," was all he said. "He knows everything." The day Mark finally reached out, I was sitting in my temporary apartment, a sad little one-bedroom where I'd been hiding from the world. My phone lit up with his name, and I stared at it for so long it went to voicemail. When it started ringing again immediately, I knew I had to answer. Can we meet? His voice sounded different, hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. I agreed to meet him at the park where we had our first date. Ironic, right? Going back to the beginning to discuss our end. When I saw him, my heart squeezed in my chest. He looked awful. Unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, wearing the same sweatshirt he'd worn the day he left our house. He couldn't even look at me at first. Just stood there with his hands shoved in his pockets, shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of the world. I kicked him out, he said finally, his voice rough. After David showed me everything, I confronted him. He tried to lie his way out of it at first, but when I showed him Lauren's messages, he just laughed. Actually laughed, Sarah. Said he was doing me a favor because you were making me soft. Mark's voice cracked on the last word. I stood there, arms crossed over my chest, trying to hold myself together. Part of me wanted to comfort him. That's how messed up this whole thing was. He had believed lies about me, abandoned our marriage, put me through hell. And still, some broken part of me wanted to tell him it would be okay. I'm so sorry, he whispered, finally looking at me. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know I can't just say sorry and make this right. But Sarah, you have to understand, I never thought Jake would. I never imagined he could. That's the problem. I cut him off, surprised by how steady my voice was. You never thought Jake could do anything wrong. You trusted him more than you trusted me, your wife. The person you promised to love and cherish above all others. Mark took a step toward me, but I backed away. I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. We can get counseling. Start over. I'll cut Jake out completely. Please, Sarah, we can fix this. I felt tears burning in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not this time. Not for him. Fix this? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Fix what, Mark? The trust you shattered? The nights I spent crying myself to sleep while you were out with him? The way our friends looked at me like I was some kind of monster? What exactly do you want to fix? He ran his hands through his hair, a nervous habit I used to find endearing. Now it just reminded me of all the little things I'd lost. All of it, he said. Everything. I know I messed up. I know I should have believed you. But Sarah, it's us. We've been through so much together. That's just it, I said, finding strength in my own words. It was us. We were supposed to be a team, but the moment Jake pointed his finger at me, you stopped being my teammate. You didn't even fight for us. You just gave up. I was confused. He tried to explain. Jake had been my best friend for so long, I couldn't imagine he'd lie about something like this. He knew everything about our relationship. He was always there. That's the problem right there. I cut him off. He was always there. Every decision, every moment, every milestone in our marriage had Jake's fingerprints all over it. And you never saw how wrong that was. I watched as realization dawned on his face. All the moments Jake had interrupted, all the times he'd inserted himself into our private life, all the red flags we'd ignored. Mark looked physically ill. The worst part? I continued, unable to stop now that the words were flowing. I started doubting myself. I actually lay awake at night wondering if maybe I had done something wrong, if maybe I was the problem. Do you know what that feels like? To have your reality completely twisted around until you don't even trust your own memories? Sarah, please. Mark's voice cracked again. I'll do anything. We can start over, move to a new city. Anything you want, just please don't let this be the end of us. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something shift inside me. 6 months ago, I would have given anything to hear those words. I would have jumped at the chance to fix our marriage, to have my husband back. But now I just felt tired. You know what I've learned through all this? I said, sitting down on a nearby bench. Sometimes the hardest part isn't losing someone you love. It's realizing that they never trusted you as much as you trusted them. Mark sat next to me, careful to leave space between us. I do trust you, he whispered. No, I shook my head. You don't, you didn't, and maybe you never did. Because if you had, Jake's lies wouldn't have mattered. If you had, you would have looked at me, really looked at me, and known I could never do what he accused me of. The silence that followed felt heavy with all the things we'd lost. I could hear children playing somewhere in the park, their laughter a stark contrast to our moment of grief. I started seeing a therapist, I said finally. She helped me understand something important. This isn't just about Jake's lies or your belief in them. It's about respect. Self-respect. And I lost mine somewhere along the way, trying to prove myself worthy of your trust, trying to compete with Jake for my own husband's attention. Mark started to speak, but I held up my hand. Let me finish. I need to say this. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I deserve someone who chooses me first. Someone who believes in me without needing proof. Someone who fights for our relationship instead of running away at the first sign of trouble. But I loved you, Mark said softly, staring at his hands. I still love you. I stood up, needing the physical distance to say what came next. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes you need more, like trust, respect, and the courage to stand by your partner even when your best friend is telling you not to. 3 months have passed since that day in the park. Mark still sends me messages sometimes, usually late at night when I assume he's had a few drinks. He tells me he misses me, that he's in therapy now too, that he hasn't spoken to Jake since everything came out. Part of me hopes he's healing, learning, growing. But another part of me, the stronger part, knows it doesn't matter anymore. I've started rebuilding my life piece by piece. Moved to a new apartment across town, one that's actually mine, not just a temporary escape. Some of our old friends have reached out, apologizing for believing Jake's lies. Some haven't. I'm learning that's okay too. Not everyone who walks out of your life needs to be invited back in. Last week, I saw Jake at a coffee shop. A different one, ironically. He had the nerve to try to apologize, said he was in a bad place when he did what he did. I just walked out without saying a word. Some actions don't deserve the dignity of a response. The hardest part isn't the loneliness, though there are nights when it hits hard. The hardest part is accepting that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who trust us the least. Mark chose to believe the worst about me, and no amount of apologizing can undo that choice. So here I am, 32 years old and starting over. But you know what? Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Because this time, I'm choosing me first. And if there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that sometimes the end of a story isn't really the end. It's just the beginning of a better one. They say when you break a bone, it grows back stronger at the point of fracture. I used to think that was just something people said to make you feel better about being broken. But now, standing on the other side of all this, I think I finally understand. My heart didn't just break. It shattered. And when I put it back together, I made sure to build it with stronger walls and better boundaries. Not to keep love out, but to make sure that next time, anyone who wants in has to be worthy of the trust I place in them. Sometimes I catch myself looking at our old wedding photos, and instead of feeling that sharp pain I used to feel, I just smile sadly at the woman I was. The one who thought love meant having to constantly prove herself worthy. If I could tell her one thing, it would be this. The right person won't make you fight for a place in your own marriage. They'll fight alongside you, not against you. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't staying and fighting for a broken relationship. It's walking away and fighting for yourself instead.